So I was experiencing so much resistance to recording in this way because it feels so sort of inherently transgressive to culture as it's emerged over the last couple of thousand years. So the way that I'm going to get around that is simply by going into the content that I want to talk about. I've been trying to answer the question, what is it that makes humans human? Trying to uncover the core of human culture, essentially. And I was looking at some anthropology to do that. I finished off that essay by Roy Allen in this book, which is still here, Human Origins. And what we worked out, it's kind of, I worked it out better in a written format, actually, writing a little summary. So I'll include that in the video description. But it's basically this ability that we have to have this deep engagement, a reciprocal engagement with the world that we're in, that allows us to be more deeply aware of what's happening, that we can actually practice in such a way as to cultivate awareness. So this reciprocal dynamic with the world itself. Now, it can be really helpful when being in the world to tell a story which is quite simple. Because when we live in that story, like this is who I am, this is what I'm up to, it's just much easier. It allows everything to move fluidly. But humans worked out this way of not just putting things in one single black and white story, but being able to tell different stories, to update our not only our knowledge but our awareness of who we are. So the sense of who we are in the world is actually something that would evolve and change. One way to describe that is that beneath the layer of our narrative identity, there's a part of our, let's say, cognition that John Vervaeke has been calling perspectival and participatory knowing. And I don't particularly want to summarize that here because it's been articulated by me and by him, among other people, in other places. What I want to suggest is that it's our access to the perspectival and participatory depths of our being. It's that which allows us to re-experience the world iteratively in a different, ongoingly updating, evolving way. It's not just being well fitted to the world, it's actually the evolution of adaptiveness. in our experience. That's what we worked out how to do. And it's that which we've been cut off from as well in terms of cultural decline. And so the idea, I mean, the prescription for like, hey, what's the cultural download that we need in order to get through, let's say, the 21st century? There's a lot of different pieces that we need, but a fair take on the cultural piece is, can we have this ecology of practices in a community of practitioners running a kind of wisdom school? And with a combination of practices that are dialogical, imaginal, mindfulness practices, and embodiment practices that can support us, help us to access the perspectival and participatory depths of our being. And so reconnect us with what we can see from here is actually the core of culture, the core of what it means to be human. What I want to explore today is like we know that that's something that's been already going on a long time in the past that we've been disconnected from. The source of life, the source of our humanity, the source of our human culture, and also the source of consciousness. Can't really say that consciousness has a source, but allow me that for the moment. And so, as an example, in connection with the perspectival and participatory layers of our being, Viveki has been talking about ritual and even about theurgy through Gregory Shaw and divination. And so, ritual kind of fits in with this whole picture. I've been talking about symbolic participation and the imaginal world and narrative and myth and archetypal memory, right? Well, ritual is a component of that whole conglomeration. So, what is it about ritual? Why ritual? How does participation in the collective allow us to update our stories of who we are? I think that's a reasonable orienting question at this point. One of my misgivings here is that there are two authors to this paper named Chris Knight and Jeremy Lewis. One of the things that I appreciated about the previous paper from Roy Ellen is that it wasn't political. It was apolitical, as far as I could tell, in a way that I found approachable. Whereas Chris Knight, the lead author in this paper, is an anarchist and a Marxist. Um, and I find that to be less palatable. It's less palatable because it means there can be other agendas at work than what are supposed to be scientific agendas, let's say. And indeed, some people have criticized his work for being sort of an imposition of a certain story. And I would say that I'm interested in, yeah, finding the stories which are naturally emergent rather than imposing them in a top-down way. And so one doesn't need to consider this work that we're going to talk about to be final or authoritative. I would call it an interesting exploration that, yeah, it helped me to get into a certain sphere of knowledge, a certain world of understanding, to start to understand better what is it, how does ritual connect with sacredness, for example, and why such activity is so important for the maintenance and updating of the collective intelligence. of human cultures. So there's a way that I feel that Chris Knight is sort of, he feels that he sort of worked it out and got the chapter is called Towards a Theory of Everything. And there's been that's quite ironic title in some ways. So anyway, I'm just going to start talking about what's in the text, and we don't need to take it as a gospel. That's the invitation. Before we begin, Chris Knight, I'll read at the end, is best known for his 1991 book Blood Relations, Menstruation, and the Origins of Culture. He's a co-founder with Jim Herford of the Evolution of Language series of international conferences, and he's published many chapters and articles on the origins of language and helped edit 6 volumes on such topics. He's now a senior research associate at University College London, and he was, until his retirement in 2009, professor of anthropology at University of East London. He's written a lot on Chomsky. And Jeremy Lewis is reader in social anthropology at UCL. He studies hunter-gatherers and former hunter-gatherers across Central Africa. After researching the impact of the genocide on Rwanda's Twa Pygmies, he worked with Mbengele Pygmies in Congo Brazzaville on egalitarian politics, child socialization, play, religion, and communication. This has led to publications on egalitarianism, language, music, taboo, property, and interethnic relations, examining the impact of global forces on forest people across the Congo Basin has led to research into human rights abuses, discrimination, economic and legal marginalization, and to applied research supporting conservation efforts by forest people. He is co-director of the Extreme Citizen Science Research Group and of CAOS, the Center for the Anthropology of Sustainability. So, Chris Knight and Jeremy Lewis, Towards a Theory of Everything. Toward the end of the 19th century, when popular Darwinism and evolutionism were still much in vogue, armchair anthropologists invented a rich variety of theories of origin, the assumption being that one theory would be needed to explain the emergence of religion, another the origins of law, another the origins of language, and so forth. It was not until the 1930s that the rise of functionalism put an end to all this. Field workers, inspired by Bronislaw Malinowski, insisted that in any given community, the system of cosmological beliefs, mode of subsistence, linguistic patterns, and so forth all intertwine to form a functional whole, making it impossible to imagine how one component could exist for a moment without all the others. The implication was clear. To explain the origins of, say, language, an adequate theory would have to account simultaneously for all the other things which presuppose language and underpin its use. The point is as valid today as it ever was. Taken in isolation, there can be no such thing as a theory of the origins of language. There can be no such thing as a theory of the origins of morality, law, totemism, exogamy, kinship, or indeed anything else. To explain any one feature, we need to explain the whole, a challenging prospect. For most of the past century, social anthropologists have responded by avoiding biological and evolutionary questions altogether, resulting in a situation in which biological and social anthropologists rarely speak to one another. Okay, brief pause. Briefly to comment, it seemed that, yeah, when people sit around and do their anthropology that way, then that breeds a lot of different theories. The idea is to actually go out and do ethnographies and get in touch with different groups of people to learn about them rather than simply coming up with theory. There was also the understanding that, hey, these communities, they exist as a functional whole. And what we're really trying to look at is what makes that community whole, rather than explaining one single component of it. Yeah, and then the understanding was that because of that, it's simply easier to avoid biological questions. And we're wanting to redress that by taking a look at biological questions. And I'd also say there's like such a emphasis on explaining things, and that's actually not what we're hoping to do today. We're simply hoping to get in touch more deeply with a lot that we've forgotten, because the whole actually can't be explained. Okay, when physicists talk today of a theory of everything, they're wondering whether general relativity theory and quantum mechanics might one day be reconciled within a deeper body of theory underlying both. For anthropologists, the closest parallel might be the hope for an elegant theoretical means of bridging the gulf between the Darwinian paradigm currently prevailing in biological anthropology, sometimes known as selfish gene theory, and the radically different, more holistic approaches adopted by social and cultural anthropologists. One brilliant armchair anthropologist got tantalizingly close to a theory of everything in the 1890s. Emil Durkheim argued that a certain kind of action, collective ritual action, could establish simultaneously totemism, law, exogamy, and kinship, in addition to distinctively human thought and language. Everything began, according to Durkheim, when a flow of blood periodically ruptured relations between the sexes. All blood is terrible, he observed, and all sorts of taboos are instituted to prevent contact with it. During menstruation, females would exercise a type of repulsing action which keeps the other sex far from them. This was the origin of the incest taboo. As women bled, it was as if they were wounded game. And since men were related to their own mother through blood, this triggered the idea that the blood of kinship united them equally to the animals they hunted. Thus, a single bloodstream ran through the veins of women and animals alike, suggesting the blood's ultimate source in an ancestor who combined human and animal features, the totem. Once menstrual blood had been linked in this way with the blood of the hunt, it became logically possible for a hunter to respect certain animals as if they were his kin, this being the essence of totemism. Within the group's shared blood resided its god, or totem, from which it follows that the blood is a divine thing. When it runs out, the god is spilling over. It's a quote from Durkheim in 1963. So pausing there. Again, like it's already a lot, right? So the key insights being that collective ritual action is quite central to human culture. And what we're exploring is why that is. What's this collective ritual action? What does it achieve for us? And there was a combination there was an inherent association between blood and taboo that we observed. And there was a connection between the blood of women, the blood of animals, and sacredness. Yeah, so because of that, because of that symbolic association, a certain totem or god was understood to aggregate shared features. So I wrote that menstrual blood was central to taboo boundaries and to totemic identity by association. And the obvious question that comes from there is what determines the association between the blood of women and the blood of animals? And that's what we go more deeply into. Durkheim's case was that distinctively human conceptual thought can be explained on the basis of this one development. Once humans and kangaroos had been constructed as sharing the same clan blood, it became logical for a man of that particular clan to identify himself as a kangaroo. To think in this way, continued Durkheim, might seem paradoxical, violating what he termed the principle of contradiction. Humans and kangaroos are different species. You can be one or the other, but not both. And yet, continued Durkheim, the distinguishing feature of human symbolic thought is precisely this. Quote, is not the statement that a man is a kangaroo equal to identifying the two with each other? But our manner of thought is not different when we say of heat that it is a movement, or of light that it is a vibration of the ether, etc. Every time that we unite heterogeneous terms by an internal bond, we forcibly identify contraries. End quote. Durkheim is here pointing out that human conceptual thought is, above all, metaphorical, an idea which in recent years has become standard. Statements that are true by definition are circular and obvious. To think creatively is to discern truth on a deeper level by means of metaphors. Expressions which, interpreted literally, are patent falsehoods. The ability to seek out and discern meaning in such falsehoods is the unique distinguishing feature of human conceptual thought. Whereas other species rely heavily on categorical perception, allocating objects and events to either or categories, humans think conceptually on an additional level by combining opposites, dissolving familiar categories, and in the process, imaginatively creating new ones. Okay, pausing again. There's a couple of central insights from that. Firstly, we saw that ritual, and this is maybe referring to the previous section that I was reading, ritual involves a kind of imaginal enactment. So it involves this assuming and assigning of identities to act as if one is the kangaroo, for example, and to do that in a ritual way. This is imaginal enactment. It's taking on, assuming a certain identity and assigning identities around one's action so as to experience the world in that way. That assuming and assigning of identities is a feature of participatory knowing. We saw that this kind of a symbolic association to think as if one thing is another thing, that's really central to human cognition. Our thought itself is metaphorical. What is distinct about our species is its ability not only to divide the world into either or categories, but to dissolve those categories, to find the ways that different opposites go together and are actually one whole. And it was that acting as if, that going together, the paradoxical combination, that was the basis of ritual, of assuming a certain identity in a ritual. Okay, so that all seems quite clear so far. So, okay, by adopting certain identities in a ritual context, one can dissolve certain old stories and give rise to new stories. That kind of makes sense. Let's keep going. Just as the Victorians hoped to invent one theory to explain the origins of language, another for religion, and so forth, so until very recently, the evolutionary emergence of language was subdivided into the quite separate challenges of explaining symbols and explaining grammar. The linguist Derek Bickerton, for example, divides language evolution into two steps. The first, establishing a proto-language of grammatically unconnected words, while the second conjures grammar into being. In the same vein, evolutionary psychologist Michael Tomasello suggests that language is a complex outcome of human cognitive and social processes taking place in evolutionary, historical, and ontogenetic time, and different aspects of language, for example, symbols and grammar, may have involved different processes in different evolutionary times. Seems quite obvious. Let's keep going. In contrast to this approach, we endorse Smith and Hoefler in claiming that metaphor offers a single solution to the two evolutionary subproblems. The cognitive mechanisms underlying metaphor, according to these scholars, underpin not only symbols and grammar, but all distinctively human communication, both linguistic and non-linguistic, from its prehistorical beginnings to the present. Metaphor is the underlying principle of all that is distinctive about human language and thought. Even scholars such as Dan Sperber and Deirdre Wilson, who insist that metaphor is not a theoretically important notion in the study of verbal communication, they do so because they consider the concept too broad, all verbal utterances requiring more than literal decoding. Quote, we claim that metaphors are not exceptional and that the linguistic content of all utterances, even those that are literally understood, vastly determines their interpretation. Sorry, vastly underdetermines their interpretation. So far from being exceptional, saying one thing while meaning another is the norm. Okay, pausing. Basically, metaphorical cognition, like the symbolic cognition, the use of metaphor, really explains a lot about what's unique about humanity. So this ability to think and act in terms of that thinking, to act as if one thing is another thing, or to act as if one thing is not another thing. That seems to be explains a lot of how we do things. And everything is so metaphorical that it might as well be a useless construct. Let's move on. A metaphor is, taken literally, a false statement. Faced with this, the hearer must try to work out the speaker's communicative intention, deciding between possibilities on the basis of assumed relevance. The simple metaphor, John's a real pig, for instance, might be interpreted in various ways depending on the context. It might mean that John is very messy, that he is very fat, that he is gluttonous, or more generally, that he is badly behaved. The metaphor's less relevant meaning components, for example, having a curly tail, must be ignored for communicative success to be achieved. So this is saying that relevance realization governs our interpretation of metaphors. Durkheim understood this when he faced with the Aboriginal Australian assertion that a man might really be a kangaroo. Instead of dismissing the idea as irrational, he insisted that it reveals to us the workings of man's scientific mind. Durkheim took his illustrations mainly from Australia, where a group of clan members during an initiation ceremony might enact, say, the kangaroo dance, jumping or leaping like kangaroos. With extraordinary insight, he realized that communal activities of this metaphorical kind lie at the basis of all symbolic thinking, including modern science. So here we have this insight that there is a reinforcing process between communal ritual activity and symbolic cognition. They go together and mutually reinforce each other. In Durkheim's evolutionary narrative, totemism and exogamy emerge together as the earliest form of ritual and social organization. Communal participation in dancing, singing, and other ritual performance forges bonds of solidarity, while at the same time, body and mind are seized by a metaphorical representation of their existence as a collective. That metaphor, the totem, is the creature whose movements and appearance are acted out in the dance. We're talking about the phenomenon of possession, which here is the same as which is also the phenomenon of communion, common union. We're talking about ritualized access to collective identity, not only through ritual, but through dancing and singing, right? Through totemism. Yeah, communal participation in dancing, singing, and other ritual performance not only forges bonds of solidarity, but at the same time, body and mind are seized by a metaphorical, not representation, but experience. It's an experience as the existence of the collective. Okay, there are clear links there to collective intelligence, to distributed cognition, to collective identity. To me, there's also an obvious link to sacredness. And I think I would say here it's this when we can deeply participate in rituals of that kind, then our identities can be temporarily dissolved and reconstituted by taking a different perspective, participating more deeply in life, and then returning back into the same or a different identity, the same or a different story as is required. Okay, let's keep going. Published in 1897, the earliest version of Durkheim's theoretical model was strongly gendered, with men and women facing each other in opposite camps. Women repulse the other sex with their symbolically potent blood, each dancer's menstrual blood being equated with that of a kangaroo or other game animal. As a result, men jointly perceive their mothers and sisters as active participants in the sacredness of the kangaroo or other emblem of the clan. As sacred beings, these women establish themselves as sexually prohibited, just as the meat of the totemic species becomes prohibited flesh. In this way, a powerful communal metaphor enforces a unitary principle of exogamy, which applies alike to human and non-human kin. What I said here was that the taboo boundaries reinforced with menstrual blood and ritual, this connection between the sacredness of women experienced as such and the sacredness of animals experienced as such in ritual that gave rise to shared participation in sacredness and also to prohibition, or in other words, saying no. Okay, there can be no doubt that Durkheim glimpsed here a theory of everything, a way of explaining the emergence of human society, morality, religion, and language in one theoretical move. His ethnographic sources were conscientiously examined and accurately cited, subsequent studies amply confirming his initial insight. Durkheim rightly understood that Aboriginal Australian totemic symbolic equations flow naturally and logically from an initial situation in which women's blood is equated with that of the animals men love to hunt. So the root of this collective ritual action seems to be this link between this equation between menstrual blood and animal blood, which share a sense of sacredness or taboo regarded by the group. Okay, from here, it gets a little bit slightly harder to follow because we start quoting a lot from different groups, and we're simply going to continue through that. 20th century ethnographers have confirmed that this linkage is a constant theme in songs, myths, and rock art from across the continent. And I'm going to mess up the pronunciation, so I really apologize for that, but that's hopefully I can be forgiven. An example is David McKnight's 1975 discussion of how meat becomes Nagainja, sacred or taboo, among the Wicmuncan Aborigines of Cape York Peninsula. Quote, any act suggestive of menstrual bleeding makes things Nagainchla. Thus, if blood from an animal falls on a woman's lap, her father and many other male relatives may not eat it. If a young man carries meat on his back or shoulders, so that the blood runs down between his buttocks, this, to the Wicmuncan, is too uncomfortably like menstrual blood to be ignored. End quote. It is not surprising, then, to learn that when men cut up the flesh of a recently killed game animal, quote, they make certain that women, especially their daughters, stand well away. Men will not even take fish from a daughter if she has caught it with a fishing line and pulled the line so that it falls on her lap. If a daughter should accidentally sit on her father's possessions, then they are Nagaincha to him. I might add that blood from wounds is also considered to be Nagaincha, though not to the same degree as menstrual blood. End quote. Menstruation is sacred, even taboo, but as a mark of fertility, it is especially tempting and difficult to resist. Men fantasize about such women, as these lines from a Western Arnhem Land erotic song cycle clarify. Quote, like blood from a speared kangaroo, sacred blood flows from the uterus. They are always there, at the wide expanse of water, the sea eagle nests. They are sacred, these young girls of the Western tribes, with their menstrual flow. They are always there, sitting within their huts like sea eagle nests, with blood flowing down from the sacred uterus of the young girl, sacred blood flowing in all directions, like blood from a speared kangaroo from the sacred uterus. Far away in Central Australia, we find similar themes. Among the most important and powerful figures in Aranda mythology are the Alknarincha women. They are characteristically depicted as menstruating together. In one song, the awesomely powerful women cut their breasts. Quote, on their breasts they make scars, they slap their thighs, they are menstruating. Their flanks are wet with blood, they talk to each other. End quote. An Alknarincha may be recognized in a myth by the fact that she is constantly decorating herself with red ochre, is associated with water, and is frequently represented as menstruating copiously. Alknarincha women possess bull roars and other symbols of power and have solidarity. evoked in one song through the image of a clump of bushes, quote, so thick and so pressed against each other that they cannot move separately. The Alknarincha are also known as women who refuse men. The name Alknarincha means, in fact, eyes turn away. From another song come these lines. They say, I won't go with you. I will remain an Alknarincha. They whirl their bull roarers. They stay where they are. They sit very still. The man wants them to say, I will go with you, but they remain where they are. If I may briefly pause and add a couple of synthesizing comments. We saw that the symbolic association between menstrual blood and animal blood ran very deep, so that it showed up as a kind of taboo or uncomfortability in many different aspects of cultural life. We saw that in at least one example was perhaps why women weren't involved in hunting, because especially at that time, was regarded as taboo. We also saw that there was a connection between taboo and temptation. They seem to go together. And finally, we were looking at, in a sense, the origins of feminine power, this shared coalition, which was mythologized. We're now going to continue. The strength of Durkheim's origins theory is its parsimony and simplicity. Instead of multiple different theories to explain how symbolic culture emerged, we are offered just one. Yet it could have been simpler still. Despite the elegance of his theory, Durkheim offers no simple logical explanation for its key feature, the identification of women's blood with the blood of the hunt. Durkheim marshals ethnographic details, confirming that across Australia the blood does have this symbolic significance. But he does not explain how or why hunter-gatherers across Australia should ever have arrived at that idea. Durkheim's theories were unfortunately never followed up or appreciated as key to an understanding of how symbolic culture evolved. In recent years, however, hunter-gatherer ethnographers have been able to confirm that his insights about blood were essentially correct. On one level, human or animal blood is just a biological substance. But for traditional hunter-gatherers across the world, it is much more than that. It is the primary material from which their most sacred ritual metaphors derive. Anyone familiar with Judaic, Muslim, or Christian traditions, as Durkheim certainly was, will realize that things have not changed. Examples of blood symbolism abound in virtually all cultures, being especially complex and prominent among Australian hunter-gatherers. But sometimes a detailed focus on a particular society can shed light on the wider picture. With this in mind, we turn now to work conducted recently among the Bayaka Pygmy inhabitants of the forests of the Congo Basin. The value of this is that it shows how women actively construct the metaphor of their blood as that of the hunt, thereby turning it into something sacred. Okay. Briefly, we saw that the authors of this paper really like Durkheim's idea. And we can see how, like it says, for example, but for traditional hunter-gatherers across the world, it is much more than that. This association between human and animal blood. It is the primary material from which their most sacred ritual metaphors derive. That may in fact be true, but it may not be true of all peoples everywhere. And that's probably what the pushback is about, right? It's like we don't want to take one explanatory principle and push it too far. But certainly we're looking into blood symbolism as an example of why there can be a symbolic association between two things which are, we would call, in fact, not the same. But the simplest, the sim, the yeah, um, synthesis or integration of that paragraph would simply be that human and animal blood seems to hold an inherent kind of sacredness cross-culturally, and we're inquiring as to why that is by examining one particular culture from a completely different part of the world. Rather than Australia, we're going to the Congo Basin. Let's continue. Most people, older women assume primary responsibility for teaching younger ones the importance of dancing and singing, valuing such activity as a primary means of influencing the behavior of males. The fact that women and men form counterposed communities, assertively responding to and thereby shaping one another's sexual strategies, sheds a very different light on Durkheim's original argument, from which any hint of conflict or struggle is strangely absent. For Durkheim, women's blood of its own accord somehow repulses the opposite sex. What's missing in Durkheim's account is an understanding of women's active role in periodically defying male sexual desire. Whereas Durkheim presents menstrual blood as possessing a force which independently repulses males, his theory makes more sense when it's realized that women, like the Alknerincha sacred beings of Aranda myth, actively refuse men at the moment when they are most desired. Only then does it become clear why metaphorical shape changing, collectively assuming animal form, is a logical strategy of gender defiance. And only then, finally, does it become clear why and how women establish their own blood as mystically connected with that of the animals men hunt. Okay, so again, a lot of information was just presented in those two paragraphs. We saw how dancing and singing, especially collectively in groups, strongly influences men. And the older women had a prerogative to teach younger women how to do that, according to the authors of the paper. We also saw that the recognition of different sexual strategies by men and women in these groups uh, could offer a kind of modification of Durkheim's argument. And so this kind of what's conceived here as a collective feminine ritual of working together in a coalition to essentially deny men sexuality. Sorry, deny men sex. It combined a kind of strong power base, maximal desire of those women with also denial. It also combined collective identity, sacredness or religiosity, and also theriomorphism, or theriomorphism meaning becoming like an animal that was connected with blood. All these things were going together. I think we can see that we're going to start inquiring more deeply about this metaphorical shape changing. What is that about? Why are we doing that? And yes, we can understand that as a logical strategy of gender defiance. I think we can also understand it in other ways. There's something about assuming the identity of the totem animal, for example, that has an effect to transform who our sense of who we are and our collective identity. And I think the we can understand that in ways that are not limited to a logical strategy of gender defiance. Okay, let's continue. To grasp how women achieve this practice, we may turn to a special word in the lexicon of the Bayaka forest people, which for them has a host of meanings. Ekila. Ekila can refer to menstruation, blood, taboo, a hunter's meat, good hunting luck, the power of animals to harm humans, and particular dangers to human reproduction, human production, human health, and sanity. It's a very complex category. As an elderly male informant explained, quote, a woman's Aquila is with the moon. When a woman is Aquila, menstruating, her husband takes on her smell. So he doesn't go hunting or walking in the forest with friends. Animals flee when they smell a woman's mobeku, ritual danger. The animals smell her on him. If strong animals, like gorillas, elephants, buffalo, or leopards, smell it, they will come, even from far away, charging towards him in a rage, passing other people just to get to him. Here we saw that there's this phenomenon. There's a kind of phenomenon where, according to the informant, menstruation seemed connected with pheromones, I would say, and animal behavior. So there's a deep connection between the menstruation of the women in the group, this complex category that they call Aquila, and their hunting behavior. Another informant explains, Aquila is the same as Mobeku. That's the name of the medicine god, Gomba, that sent women when women were put in the moon. The business of Aquila was first with them. It's all about children. You can see women's tummies swell up at this time. It's the wind. They have to expel their wind as Aquila, blood. This cleans out their wombs. Women's biggest husband is the moon. If I'm a hunter, I don't sleep around with different women. If I sleep with her, and then her, all the animals would know. They would smell my smell and know that hunter has ruined his own Aquila, ruined his hunting. Some will come with great anger. Others, you shoot them, but they won't die. You are very surprised. When you shoot at an antelope from close range and it doesn't die, we call this Aquila. Okay, again, complex quote from that informant. What I gathered from that is that there's a kind of when he said it's about the wind, well, wind to me is like a symbol of the spirit in this context. So there's a connection between menstruation and spirituality, I would say. Menstruation seemed tied to their religious practice. Quote, women's biggest husband is the moon. There's a kind of symbolic uh, connection and kind of erotic connection with the moon that seemed to be enacted in ritual practice, and it was connected with menstruation. But it was also clear that it's also clearly connected with hunting magic, like the hunting behavior and monogamy also. So the idea was that if this menstrual power, this symbolic power, if it was disrupted by sleeping around, then all the animals would come and be very upset or run away from the hunter. There's one final short quote, and then we get back to the main part of the text. Quote, if you are Mabeku, animals attack you. In big forest full of large game, having sex is Mobeku, a huge Aquila. This is because we are in conflict with the animals. If they smell the odor of women, some are frightened and flee you. Others come from far away and follow you, only you. That's why women are frightened in the forest. The animals smell them. But to me, I gathered simply that they understand that this connection between the animals and the women is very, very deeply tied. So the connection between menstrual blood and animal blood seems more than simply symbolic or ritualized. It seems to be connected with the behavior of animals and hunting behavior among animals and humans. Okay, now we return to the main part of the text. While it is male informants who are speaking here, to understand the logic, we must turn to the female community to find out in greater detail what Aquila really means. For women and men alike, collective ritual action is fundamental to the day-to-day maintenance of Ikila. Ngoku is women's all-female ritual association, the counterpart of the men's ejengi, which is like women's business and men's business, essentially. I'm talking about like women's circles and men's circles, like they do separate work together, right? They're talking about an all-female ritual association, right? After her initiation into the women's secret society, it is only with the onset of her first menstrual flow that a girl is suddenly referred to as Ekila. This arouses in her a curiosity to delve deeper into the secrets of her sex, learning about procreation and related aspects of cosmology. Ngoku specifically instructs her in how to use sexual attraction to control men. Women's communal singing and dancing establishes their solidarity so they can band together to resist male violence, periodically withdrawing sex to exert leverage in achieving key goals. Central among these is the proper sharing of meat and respect for egalitarian political norms. Okay, we saw there that there was a connection between the work among different genders or different sex, like men's work and women's work. There was a connection there between women's work, secret knowledge, initiation, religiosity or sacredness, and sacred practice, and cosmology or like the world building, our understanding of the world that we're in, metaphysics, early metaphysics, cosmology, right? And that's all tied to menstruation in this community, in this culture. Yeah, we also saw that this communal ritual activity, sexuality, social influence, and egalitarianism all seem to be tied together. So let's keep going a bit. Quote, while hunters penetrate with their spears and cause dangerous blood to flow, women's priority is to control not only this bloodshed, but also their own, rendering it safe and life-bringing to the human group through a range of strategies, which include the controlled use of fire, a technology which, as Levi-Strauss famously clarified, transforms dangerous, raw, bloody meat into desirable flesh, whether human or animal, now safely available and cooked. The gendered rituals of the two sexes balance out and interact in this way. Sorry. The gendered rituals of the two sexes balance out and interact in this way, jointly establishing the core metaphorical equivalences of Ikila, metaphorical equivalences between men killing animals and women birthing children, between the spearing of animals and the penetration of women's bodies in intercourse, between menstrual blood and the blood of the hunt. One way that I tried to summarize that was by working on this sort of constellations, and it seemed that uh, male behavior in this case seemed more connected with hunting, and it seemed more connected with kind of uncontainment or releasing, um, was connected with activity, with kind of progression, with making something happen, and also with danger and differentiation into the many, involvement in the world. Whereas the female behavior seemed more connected with ritual rather than hunting, although the rituals may have to do with hunting. And it had seemed to seemingly more to do with containment rather than uncontainment. And it also had to do with sort of management of the community with towards safety and integration. All right, continuing. Among biologists and evolutionary ecologists, it's well understood that for primates in general, it is the females whose foraging and reproductive strategies ultimately determine the direction of evolutionary change. Regardless of whether or how much they dominate, the fact that primate males go where the females are means that female decision making is always paramount. This basic understanding of how things work tends to get set aside by modern advocates of man the hunter, but we see no justification for this. Even if the dominance in our ancestors was so extreme that male control over basic resources characterized all human evolution, as some assert, this would not make male decision making the driver of human evolutionary change. We need to set out from theoretical fundamentals. Since we were once primates, it follows that if males in our case alone came to drive evolution, we would still need to ask at which particular stage and through which initially female strategies males stopped going where the females were. To summarize that, females are key agents of selection, nature as that which selects. And female decision making is key to evolution, human evolution in particular. Quote, in our view, the best way to avoid these difficulties is to assume theoretical continuity, applying basic primordial understandings equally to evolving humans. The biological background to the scenario we favor, not discussed here, is one in which evolving hominin females had long been mobilizing assistance and support to meet their increasingly costly childcare burdens. They achieved this through a whole range of strategies, which included the phasing out of external signs of ovulation, residing where possible with the mother, extending and maintaining female coalitions, raising male levels of commitment, and cooperatively resisting the strategies of dominant male philanderers. Finally, it meant finding new ways of dealing with menstruation, which, with ovulation effectively concealed, had become salient as a cue to imminent fertility. The eventual solution involved the use of cosmetic substitutes to prevent real menstrual blood from triggering dangerous levels of intersexual and intrasexual competition and conflict. Against this background, we attribute the metaphors and equivalences of Aquila and its cross-cultural variants, in the first instance, to women's collective action in their own reproductive interests. Essentially, what that was saying is that women basically used many different strategies to garner support for their interests. One more paragraph. All this allows us to complete Durkheim's theory of everything in a much more powerful and parsimonious way, metamorphosing into animal form, bleeding in sympathy with wounded game. Such metaphorical equivalences are best seen as signals of defiance aimed at male sexual desire. If women are to use sex to control male behavior, they must, at the very least, be able to say no. And what better way to do this than to form into a defiant mass, resorting to explicit body language, dancing the way animals dance, bleeding the way animals bleed? Women's strategy is to set out from the fundamental male need for a sexual partner who is female, human, and available, and with that in mind, systematically enact an identity that is the reverse, from human to animal, from female to male, and from available to unavailable. By ritually denying men in this way, women demonstrate that they cannot be taken for granted. While welcoming men's capacities for shedding blood, they're able to insist that there are limits. Killing game animals with piercing weapons is not to be confused with using those same weapons against women or against rival males. Establishing such boundaries is in everyone's long-term interest, because otherwise, if males could resort to weapons at will, the consequences might be calamitous. Without powerful ritual inhibitions, without concepts on the model of Aquila, community survival would be placed at risk. Okay, pausing there for a minute. Again, a lot was just presented, and there's quite a bit to say about that, it seems. Yeah, we can see um, why this deep imaginal enactment. They were quite focused on sexual behavior, and I think that's definitely involved and relevant. But I think we can see that this ethereomorphism, this taking up of the identity of the animal, has a deeper function or additional functions. It has to do with a kind of conversion to the opposite, which is what Jung through Heraclitus called an antiodromia, a conversion into the opposite. So when you take something to the extreme, it turns into its opposite. It's this kind of thing. So instead of being in, for example, imagine inhabiting a certain story, imagine being a certain character in the group. Well, imagine that the character that you were being was a human female who was available. Well, imagine that ritually, meaning upon occasion, in the collectively enacted ritual of the group, that character becomes kind of the opposite. There is a collective participation in the uh, theriomorphic spirit of the group, right? It's a participation in a totemic identity, in an animal identity, and that means that the character swaps to the opposite. Instead of being a human female who is available, one instead becomes an animal male who is unavailable, which is a real turnoff, right? For the men, we would assume. Um, Yeah, I think we can see how this collective ritual action is a way that to experience a different, like to take up a different perspective, that's for sure, and to participate in the life of the group in a radically different way that can enable iterative reconstitution of identity. We also saw that this uh, women's capacity to do this was directly connected with what I'm going to call the practice of wisdom in the sense of restraint, in the sense of setting limit, and particularly limits around the use of technology. It's a way of establishing boundaries that have to do with hunting behavior, that have to do with the way that technology is used. Quote, establishing such boundaries is in everyone's long-term interest because otherwise, if males could resort to weapons at will, the consequences might be calamitous. The point would be they are. That's exactly what's going on. That's exactly what we see in the world. And it's exactly this kind of collective ritual that uh, could sort of, quote, without powerful ritual inhibitions, community survival would be placed at risk. And so I think we can see here how rituals of this kind, I don't want to say like this ritual specifically, but we can see here how collective ritual action that is sort of geared towards or oriented towards collective governance, governance of the group, governance of the use of technology in particular, has a social function, one that we're missing. Okay, I'm going to continue. I'm on page 94 of 98. We can now state the stunningly simple mechanism through which this entire complex is generated. When a menstruating dancer performs the steps and characteristic antics of a game animal, the very fact that she is bleeding now constructs that animal as a wounded one. Metaphorically, her blood is now that animal's blood. Paradoxically, it is this very identification of human with animal blood which keeps the two categories apart. Never laugh at the sufferings of an animal you have killed, insist the Bayaka. It might turn out to be your own unborn child. The Hasda have essentially the same idea, and we'll hear from the Hasda with their quote, but before I do that, I just want to unpack what was just said. It said, when a menstruating dancer performs the steps and characteristic antics of a game animal, the very fact that she's bleeding now constructs that animal as a wounded one. So to me, this would be a way for, like, I think the question would be, what decides which animal is ritually enacted? And I think probably the answer is the women decide, right? And then the question would be, how do they decide? And I imagine, although I don't know, that the answer might be whatever they feel like. Yeah, so the key question, why do they enact that particular animal? And to me, this kind of pushes the question back. Again, we were originally asking about this connection between the association between sacredness and taboo, and with menstrual blood and animal blood. Like what is it that connects those with the totem? And it had to do with this collective ritual, imaginal enactment of theriomorphism, of taking up, assuming the identity of the animal. And I think what we're seeing here now is that, like, as an example, assuming the identity of that animal will change male hunting behavior, right? As an example, it's like if they're saying it, the very fact that she's bleeding now constructs that animal as a wounded one. Well, for example, one of the effects that that could have is, um, like they stop hunting an animal that had been overhunted, right? And I'm imagining that in the context of what could be called sympathetic magic, animism, there seemed to be a deep interconnection between um, female ritual practice. It was explicitly connected with initiation, religiosity, sacredness, cosmology, secret knowledge, and menstruation. If I tie in a suggestion of altered states of consciousness, um, that seems pretty obvious at this point. What I'm suggesting is that there is actually communication from nature itself, and that by connecting to that which is natural within themselves, these women in this context are able to feel which animals to ritually identify with, and so regulate the hunting behavior of the whole tribe, and therefore sort of coordinate this, again, dynamic reciprocal feedback loop between nature and culture, or nature and humanity, you could say. That's a suggestion that's not in the text. Yeah, and the other point here was that it said metaphorically her blood is now that animal's blood. Paradoxically, it is this very identification of human with animal blood which keeps the two categories apart. So what we see is, again, like if you go sort of too far in one direction, you also need the opposite to show up somewhere. And that seemed to be why, like when there's this association of the kinds of blood in the ritual, well, the way that that shows up in, for example, the hunting behavior of the men was in the form of taboo. That these women, especially when they're menstruating, couldn't be near anything to do with the hunt. There was a big separation or boundary. So on the one hand, there was a connection, an identity, and on the other hand, a separation. And then it said, never laugh at the sufferings of an animal you've killed, insists the Bayaka. It might turn out to be your own unborn child. The Hasda have essentially the same idea. Quote, the whole process of hunting big game, male productivity, is symbolically linked with the whole process of female reproduction, female productivity. Activities in one process are mystically dangerous for activities in the other. A man whose wife is menstruating cannot hunt big game because the poison of his arrows is believed to lose its efficacy. If his wife is pregnant, he cannot walk on the tracks of a wounded game animal because this will cause it to recover from its wounds. Reciprocally, if a man whose wife is pregnant laughs at or mocks the dead but not yet dismembered carcass of a game animal, the unborn baby will be born with defects which resemble the characteristics of the dead animal. So this indicates, according to these, um, let's say, according to these ethnographies, like if these accounts are to be believed, then that's actually what they experience. It seems that the productivity of both sexes has been deeply tied to this ritually enacted sensitivity to nature. So this deep, yeah, collective ritual enactment of theriomorphism, taking up and assuming the identity of different animals. It involves a deep and intimate relationship with nature, that has implications for behavior. And if one acts in the wrong way, it's one is not rewarded by natural forces, let's suggest. Okay, let's keep going. Identifying the blood of the hunt with that of menstruation forces men to keep their wits about them, using violence with care, aware at all times that recklessly spilled blood might turn out to be their own. The blood of menstruation, then, is that of the hunt. Whereas Durkheim had to add this all-important feature to his model, in our version, it is intrinsic from the outset. Women who mimic an animal at the time of menstruation are, alone, by that fact alone, constructing Durkheim's or metaphor, the primordial metaphor from which society emerges as a moral entity. Once this conceptual equivalence has been established, it triggers a cascade of subsidiary metaphorical equivalences, as seen above, between men killing animals and women birthing children, between the spearing of animals and the penetration of women's bodies in intercourse, between taboos on menstruation and hunting taboos. These associations are ubiquitous, and it's not easy to imagine how else they might be explained. Okay, the questions here, the important point, a couple of important points that I wanted to note at this point. They said that identifying the blood of the hunt with that of menstruation forces men to keep their wits about them, using violence with care and aware at all times of recklessly spilled blood that might turn out to be their own. But it wasn't simply that metaphorical or symbolic identification of the kinds of blood that causes that. It was the activity of nature itself. As in the accounts, for example, when we were talking about Aquila, we were talking about accounts that referred to the behavior of animals, right? So what happened when people went and were hunting? So it wasn't just a symbolic or metaphorical identification that caused men to keep their wits about them. It was actually what they experienced as a result of transgressing the rules that they'd then come to learn. It was as a result of what naturally occurred that they were doing that. We can also see that it's the connection between the women's menstrual blood and animal blood was basically tied down into the ritual identification by women with an animal. Then the question is, how or why is that identity established? Like um how do they decide which animal to become, and why is that identification permitted? And the answer being quite clearly, it was through natural mystical connection with nature, which seems quite obvious. I mean, it had to do with this feedback between the activity of nature and human activity. And it seemed to be feminine-led collective ritual activity that created the context to sense that and embody it, enact it, participate in it. Now we can continue. There is a background to all this in evolutionary biology, beyond our remit here. Suffice it to say that we routinely expect female reproductive priorities to conflict in key areas with those of males. Females cannot afford to cooperate unconditionally with the opposite sex, any more than males can afford to collude unconditionally with females. So it may seem inexplicable why the males in our origins narrative should collude with the female tactics described. We cannot assume male moral sensibilities here. In an evolutionary account, taking primate sociology and psychology as our point of departure, moral constraints must be explained, not just assumed. The mere fact that women pretend to be game animals is no reason why male onlookers should collude with or join in the make-believe, especially if it means foregoing sex. It is true that a male could respond to women's pretense with violence, but there are good reasons why this might not work. Although fighting is always an option, it entails risks and costs. A violent male attacking his female partner and her allies might unwittingly endanger his own genetic offspring. Apart from that, he would have no reason to expect his male companions to support him. After all, if he did succeed in imposing his sexual dominance, they too would have good reason to feel threatened. In deciding whether to cooperate or fight, we expect the primate male to weigh up the costs and benefits. Provided the costs of violence are made sufficiently high, it may make better Darwinian sense, and so begin to feel logical and emotionally satisfying. For males to nurture their own babies, hence their own genetic future, by acknowledging female solidarity, respecting its message, cooperating in the hunt, and bringing back game to camp. Following this logic, under both pressure and seduction from females, our male ancestors willingly succumb to being fully human. It is clear that wrong species, wrong sex is on one level pure nonsense. But escaping the confines of literal truth is precisely the secret of symbolism. Saying one thing in order to mean another is the essence not only of metaphor, but of all symbolic language and life. Saying one thing in order to mean another is the essence not only of metaphor, but of all symbolic language and life. Taken literally, every metaphor is patently absurd, and claiming to be a game animal is no exception. The trickster who plays such a prominent role in hunter-gatherer narratives is endlessly switching gender and species, transforming himself into his own opposite. This trickster is sex-resistant, rebellious, and ludicrous, yet also a lustful clown, creator of antelopes and guardian of menstrual taboos. Because trickery is the secret of symbolic culture, the Kalahari Bushmen seem uncannily perceptive in considering a trickster figure, such as Gawa, the central denizen of the first order of existence. Each trick provokes laughter because it is such evident nonsense. But behind the hilarity is an egalitarian purpose, which becomes especially apparent when the story is acted out in ritual performance to the accompaniment of laughter. Yes, it looks like nonsense. But when women band together and hilariously insist in, but when women band together and hilariously insist to men that they are game animals, the implications of this metaphor, no sex, comes over loud and clear. Our scenario would seem weak if the core metaphor we have described turned out to be confined to just a small range of hunter-gatherer cultures. It's possible that on a closer examination it will turn out to be universal, a core symbolic feature of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle as such. This can be tested. So far, we've relied on Durkheim's survey of 19th century Australian ethnography, augmented with recent work among the Bayaka. But at the southern end of the African continent, among the Juhuansi and other Bushmen, we have perhaps the clearest confirmation of all. Oh yeah, this stuff's crazy, I remember this. Here we go, you ready? Among these groups, the Eland Bull Dance, in some regions, in some regions, the Gemsbok dance was the primary initiation rite, fundamental to San cultural identity. The dance celebrated a young woman's first menstruation, As she began to bleed, her senior female kin would ensure that she entered a special hut, where she would remain for several days. Inside that hut, she consorted with, or in some accounts, metamorphosed into, the great eland bull, surrounded outside by female dancers, thrusting out their buttocks while holding aloft forked sticks to mimic the horns of rutting eland cows. At this point, as the performance makes clear, women are consorting not with their usual sexual partner, but with their fantasy lover, the eland bull. It would be hard to imagine an enactment which more strikingly confirms the predictions of our model. The women are signaling to any onlooking male their message of playful yet determined defiance. Wrong species, wrong sex, wrong time. Males must not probe the signal too closely. Exam Bushman warned that staring at a girl during such proceedings might turn a man into a tree. And just to comment that it's clear that from here that initiation and this imaginally enacted theriomorphism were going together. It's connected with initiation. And also, it's hardly fantasy, especially when altered states are involved, which they most certainly were, as you can clearly tell from this. It's not a fantasy, it's a very real embodied experience. Yet another example, oh, this bit's crazy as well. Yet another example is provided by the Hadza of Tanzania, where the same logic is found. The girl's initiation ritual, known as Maitoko, reenacts the story of Mambedeko, the quote, woman with the zebra's penis. At the beginning of time, this mythical heroine would metamorphose into a male zebra, using its penis to have sex with all the other women, known as the heroine's wives. During Maitoko, women and girls to this day shed blood together in reenactment of the story, their legs adorned with zebra stripes. Echoing the wrong sex theme, when a Hadza girl first menstruates, she is congratulated for having, quote, shot her zebra. Stepping into the role of Mambedeko with her zebra penis, she conveys the message to any onlooking male that she is not available for sex. She is now the one who penetrates. Once again, wrong species, wrong sex, wrong time. Continuing, as far away as Australia, we find endless variations on these themes. Testart in 1978 perceptively describes the relationship between the rainbow serpent and menstrual blood in Aboriginal mythology as an association of opposites linked by their very contradiction. When women dance while menstruating together, they metamorphose into an immense rainbow, which is also a snake. Recorded in northeast Arnhem Land, the best known of all Aboriginal myths, the story of the two Wawilak sisters depicts this immense creature as an all-swallowing, shimmering skin enveloping menstruating women, whose blood is that of the game animals men hunt. When the snake is aroused by this blood, speared and bleeding animals placed on a fire defiantly jump up, come back to life, and dive for protection into the pool. The message wrong species, wrong sex, wrong time is here conveyed by the terrifying image of an immense creature, which is gender ambivalent, species ambivalent, conjured up by women's blood, and hostile to both cooking and exogamous sex. Here, as across much of the continent, things have got complicated over time because men have found ways of intentionally subverting women's power. Men understand full well that when shedding one another's blood during rites of initiation, they are modeling themselves on menstruating women. Quote, but really we have been stealing what belongs to them, the women, for it is mostly all women's business. And since it concerns them, it belongs to them. Men have nothing to do, really, except copulate. It belongs to the women. All that belonging to those wawilek, the baby, the blood, the yelling, their dancing, all that concerns the women. Sorry, all that concerns the women. But every time we have to trick them. Women can't see what men are doing, although it really is their own business. But we can see their side. This is because all the dreaming business came out of women, everything. In the beginning, we had nothing, because men had been doing nothing. We took these things from women. End quote. If this indigenous analysis is accepted, and much evidence supports it, with no citation, we can treat male ritual power across much of the world as modeled on a female template, with concepts reminiscent of Aquila playing a central role. This sheds fresh light on Levi-Strauss' extraordinary thesis that the world's most stubbornly surviving narratives are one myth only. The stories differ gloriously, but their grammar remains everywhere intact. This long-term conservatism of structure is perhaps still more evident in ritual, whose recurrent forms reflect facts as fundamental as the need to reconcile the priorities of the two polar opposite sexes, only one of which gets pregnant. As Bloch, 1992, explains, it is because the symbolism of ritual is an attempt to solve problems intrinsic to the human condition and based on a similar understanding of life that ritual systems are so similar and produce such similar political results. I'm going to read that again. It is because the symbolism of ritual is an attempt to solve problems intrinsic to the human condition and based on a similar understanding of life that ritual systems are so similar and produce such similar political results. Exploring sacrificial bloodshed as the irreducible core of the ritual process across traditional cultures. Bloch, in the same essay, goes on to remind us that the central notion is reversal, as in the two-way metamorphosis analyzed above, from hunter to hunted, and vice versa. We are brought back again and again to animal metamorphosis as the world's first metaphor, endorsing Durkheim's insightful attempt at a theory of everything, first proposed in 1897. We can now see more clearly than ever how a certain kind of action, collective ritual action, could establish simultaneously totemism, law, exogamy, and kinship, in addition to distinctively human thought and language. That is the end. We can simply see that yes, there's a kind of role reversal. We were talking about role reversal through sacrificial bloodshed. And in ritual, that seemed to be core to human culture, with a key focus on this enantiodromia conversion into the opposite as a way to transcend those opposites. Mm. It's a little bit tricky there because you can see that the taking the perspective of the other polarity, for example, from available female human to unavailable male non-human. This is both transcending one's normal identity, but it's also, we would say, uh, taking up a very different perspective, inhabiting a very different story, and participating in, let's say, the collective life of let's say, the tribe in a very different way than normal. And yeah, the theriomorphism or conversion into an animal, becoming an animal, ritual identification with an animal, and especially the female connectedness to nature was key to that process. Do I have anything to say at the end of that? No, I mean, that was a wild ride, don't you think? And yeah, to me, it's not really necessary to, like, they're making some quite broad, generalizing claims about the grammar of ritual. And it was definitely rich, provocative, evocative, and I mean, wow, right? Um, I think this has been my way of trying to put the maybe a little bit more abstract uh, understandings that have been taken from the previous episodes here into, like, to see some examples of how this is actually how different groups actually do this. So I'm hoping to have at least given some suggestion as to what it is about ritual that seems so important, and the different elements of that, including deep connection with nature, the origins of sacredness to do with the connection between menstrual blood and animal blood, totemism, and yeah, becoming the animal, becoming yeah, collective ritually enacting a kind of conversion into the opposite that can help us to escape the traps of our stories, which become and our identities that go along with those stories that become too rigid and too um, that we get stuck in them. Okay, I think I might close this off. So yeah, thanks for coming along for that. One might check out the rest of Chris Knight's work if one is interested. There's a 1991 book, Menstruation and the Origins of Culture, and I'm also going to explore Gary Clark relies a lot on Chris Knight in Carl Jung and the Evolutionary Sciences in 2024. We might talk about that sometime. Oh, and also Viveki's Cambridge talk. There's a After Socrates episode on ritual. I think it's about episode 13. Are both relevant from that perspective. Okay. Bye.